At 25, Mara Vale inherited a tailor shop for $9, and 3 weeks later, her brother was begging her to sell it. She didn't know why. On the afternoon of the will reading, Mara thought the $9 meant exactly what everyone else seemed to think. Nothing. The attorney placed the settlement papers in front of her and pushed his glasses higher on his nose. Mara sat at the far end of the conference table wearing the only black dress she still owned. Its zipper had broken 2 months earlier. She had fixed it with a silver safety pin that caught against her blouse whenever she moved. Across from her, her older brother Daniel looked completely at ease. He had received their grandmother's paid-off house on Bell Street, along with $184,600 in savings and investment accounts. Mara got the tailor shop. The attorney cleared his throat. The property is being transferred for $9. Mara stared at the figure. 9? Daniel laughed into his coffee. Be grateful. His voice carried across the room. Their Aunt Lillian was there. So was the family's accountant. Even the receptionist outside could probably hear him. Daniel folded his arms. Grandma found a way to leave you something without making the rest of us pay to have it demolished. Mara looked toward the attorney. He didn't smile. That told her more than Daniel's joke did. The shop had $6,740 in unpaid property taxes. The roof leaked. The electrical system had failed inspection. One of the front windows was cracked from corner to corner, and the city had issued a notice giving the owner 30 days to begin repairs or face demolition proceedings. Daniel tapped the settlement papers. You should sign today. Mara swallowed. Why did Grandma leave it to me? Daniel leaned back. Because you're the only person in this family who still thinks that place is worth saving. Stuttered Lillian finally looked up. Daniel. What? She needs to hear it. Mara did. 6 weeks earlier, the bridal shop where she worked had closed without warning. 11 days after that, her landlord changed the locks because she was $1,380 behind on rent. She had spent the next month sleeping in a friend's spare room with 2 plastic storage bins holding everything she owned. Then, Grandma died. Mara hadn't even made it to the hospital in time. She had arrived 40 minutes after the funeral home took her away. Now, Daniel had the house. Mara had $9. She reached into her handbag for the pen. Her fingers touched folded paper. She stopped. 3 nights before the funeral, Mara had found the note inside the pocket of a blue wool coat her grandmother had been sewing during her final weeks. 11 handwritten words. Whatever they tell you about the mannequin, don't let them throw it away. Mara had thought it was another one of Grandma's odd warnings. Now she unfolded the note beneath the table. Daniel saw it. His smile disappeared. For the first time that afternoon, he wasn't looking at the inheritance papers. He was staring at the note. And Mara suddenly wondered why. Mara signed the papers at 4:17 in the afternoon. The pen scratched across the final page, and the attorney slid the documents back into a neat stack. Daniel stood before she could. Good. He didn't congratulate her. He picked up his coat. At the door, he paused beside Mara. You have 30 days. For what? To deal with the shop. He gave her a look that was almost sympathetic. Don't sink money into it. Then he left. Mara remained seated for another minute, staring at the empty chair. Her grandmother had once told her that people showed their true character when they thought nobody was watching. Daniel had never bothered to check. Outside, the February rain had turned the sidewalks black. Mara walked 3 blocks to the bus stop with the settlement papers tucked inside her coat. She had $11.87 in her wallet after paying for lunch that morning. The $9 inheritance kept bothering her, not because it was insulting, because Grandma had been careful with money. Very careful. She had repaired the same iron for 20 years instead of replacing it. She saved buttons in a glass jar. She wrote grocery prices on the backs of envelopes. Once, when Mara was 14, Grandma had driven 12 miles to return a 50-cent mistake on a cashier's receipt. She would not have chosen $9 by accident. The bus arrived at 5:03. Mara climbed aboard and took a seat near the back. For most of the ride, she watched rain crawl down the window. She remembered the tailor shop as it had been when she was a child. The brass bell over the door, the smell of steam and wool, the little wooden stool where Grandma used to let her sit while she worked, and the mannequin. Mara had always hated that mannequin. It stood near the front window, taller than Grandma, with a smooth wooden neck and no face. Grandma called her Evelyn, though Mara never understood why. Every few months, Grandma changed the clothes on it, a wedding dress, a winter coat, a navy suit, but the mannequin itself never moved. Except once. Mara was 12 when she had walked into the shop early one Saturday morning and found Grandma tightening a screw beneath its wooden base. "What are you doing?" Grandma had looked up too quickly. "Nothing." "You said you were fixing Evelyn." "I was." "Why?" Grandma smiled. "Because old things need attention." At the time, Mara had accepted that answer. Now she wasn't so sure. The bus reached the end of Bell Street just after 6. Mara stepped off. The tailor shop stood 3 blocks away. She hadn't seen it in almost 2 years. She expected to feel grief. Instead, she felt embarrassed. The building looked worse than she remembered. Paint had peeled from the brick around the windows. Ivy had climbed halfway across the second floor. A plywood board covered the left window, and the front awning sagged toward the sidewalk. Above the entrance, faded gold letters still read, "Vale Tailoring." Mara stood across the street. The rain had stopped. She took out the new key the attorney had given her. For several seconds, she didn't move. Then she crossed the street. The lock turned with a hard metallic click. The door opened. A smell of dust and old fabric drifted into the evening air. Mara stepped inside. The shop was dark. She reached for the light switch. Nothing happened. Then, from somewhere near the front window, something made a small wooden sound. Click. Mara froze. Click. She looked toward the mannequin. It was still wearing Grandma's unfinished blue coat. And beneath it, almost hidden by the dust, she noticed 4 fresh scratches in the floorboards. Mara didn't touch the scratches. She stood near the doorway listening. The shop had its own sounds now that it was empty. Rainwater ticked somewhere behind the walls. A loose sign outside tapped against the brick whenever the wind moved it. From the back room came the faint smell of cedar and machine oil. Nothing else. Mara took out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam passed over the cutting table, the old sewing machines, the shelves of folded cloth. Dust had settled everywhere except along a narrow path leading from the front door toward the mannequin. She frowned. That bothered her more than the scratches. Grandma had died 8 days ago. Nobody had been supposed to enter the shop since the funeral. At least, that's what Daniel had told her. Mara walked slowly toward the mannequin. The blue coat was still pinned across its shoulders. One sleeve was unfinished. White thread hung from the cuff like a tiny loose wire. She remembered Grandma working on it the last time she had visited. "You like blue," Grandma had told her. "I like black." "You think you do." Mara smiled at the memory despite herself. Then she noticed the floor. The mannequin's wooden base was wider than she remembered. 4 brass screws held it down. 3 were covered in dust. 1 wasn't. Mara crouched. The clean screw had been turned recently. She touched it. Cold metal. Her phone vibrated in her hand. "Daniel." She let it ring. A message appeared. "You there?" Another arrived seconds later. "Don't stay overnight." Mara looked toward the front window. She typed, "Why?" The reply came almost immediately, because the building isn't safe. She stared at the message, then typed, "How would you know?" No answer. Mara slipped the phone into her coat. She found an old flashlight behind the counter and tested it. The beam flickered twice before settling. The back room was worse. A collapsed shelf blocked part of the doorway. Boxes filled the walls. Receipts from years ago sat inside a cracked metal tin. A calendar from 2019 still hung beside the sink. Mara picked up a box marked "Alterations." Inside were customer measurements written in Grandma's narrow handwriting. She recognized several names. Mrs. Bell, Mr. Ortega, the Harpers. People who had probably forgotten this place existed. At the bottom of the box was a small envelope. Mara opened it. Empty. But the envelope had one sentence written across the front. She knew Grandma's handwriting immediately. "Mara, when you find the first mark, remember this. What was buried was never meant to stay buried." Mara read it twice, then a third time. She looked back toward the front room. The mannequin stood exactly where she had left it, except the blue coat was no longer facing the window. Mara's flashlight trembled slightly in her hand. She stepped closer. The mannequin had turned just enough for its shoulder to face her. And beneath its wooden base, one of the floorboards was raised by less than an inch. Mara knelt beside the raised floorboard. For several seconds she simply looked at it, then she slid the edge of her house key underneath. The board lifted with a dry crack. Beneath it was darkness, not a hole dug into the earth. A narrow service space ran between the old floor and the foundation, barely wide enough for a hand. Mara pointed the flashlight inside. Nothing. She reached farther. Her fingers brushed something smooth, wood. She pulled out a small wooden box no larger than a paperback book. There was no lock, only a strip of faded blue cloth tied around it. Mara recognized the fabric. It matched the coat on the mannequin. Her mouth went dry. She untied the cloth. Inside the box was a photograph. Grandma stood outside the tailor shop, perhaps 30 years younger. Beside her was Mara's grandfather, Thomas Vale. Mara had almost no memories of him. He had disappeared when she was 5. That was the word her family always used. Disappeared. Nobody explained where he went. In the photograph, Thomas was holding a rolled document beneath one arm. On the back, Grandma had written a date, October 14th, 1989. Mara turned the photograph over again. Something else was written beneath the date. "Don't trust the copy." She stared at the words. A floorboard creaked behind her. Mara spun around. Nobody stood there. The front door was still locked. She checked it anyway. The deadbolt hadn't moved. When she returned to the box, she noticed a second object beneath the photograph. A brass key, small, old, stamped with the number 17. Mara picked it up. She knew that number. Grandma's shop had 17 storage drawers behind the cutting table. Mara hurried back to them. She counted 1 through 16. The 17th drawer was missing, not empty, missing. A rectangular section had been built into the wall beneath the table, covered by a piece of matching wood. Mara ran her fingers along its edges. There, a keyhole. She inserted the brass key. It turned smoothly. The hidden drawer opened with a soft scrape. Inside were several envelopes, a yellowed newspaper clipping, and a thin leather notebook. Mara picked up the newspaper first. The headline was faded, but she could still read it. Local developer accused of property fraud. Below it was a photograph of 3 men standing outside a courthouse. One of them was Thomas, Mara's grandfather. She read the article. It mentioned missing property records, forged transfers. Several families who claimed their land had been taken from them. Then one sentence stopped her. Thomas Vale, a local businessman involved in the dispute, has denied allegations of financial misconduct. Mara looked at the photograph again. Her grandfather hadn't disappeared because he wanted to leave. Someone had accused him. The leather notebook felt heavier in her hand. She opened the first page. There were only 4 words, written in Grandma's handwriting. The first deed is only the beginning. Mara whispered the sentence aloud. The first deed is only the beginning. From the front room came a sharp, metallic scrape. She closed the notebook. Someone had just tried the shop's front door. Mara switched off the flashlight. The shop went black. She stood behind the cutting table with one hand pressed against the leather notebook. Outside, a car engine idled. Then the front door handle moved again. Slowly. Once. Twice. Mara didn't breathe. A thin line of light appeared beneath the front door as headlights swept across the pavement. Someone was standing outside. She waited. The handle stopped moving. A shadow crossed the glass. Then came 3 knocks, not loud, almost polite. Mara recognized the voice when it came through the door. Mara? Daniel. She closed her eyes for a second. Then she turned on the flashlight and walked toward him. What are you doing here? Daniel stood beneath the broken awning, rainwater dripping from his coat. I called you. I saw. You weren't answering. I was busy. His eyes moved past her shoulder. The shop was dark behind her. What have you been doing? Mara kept the door only partly open. Looking around. Daniel's gaze shifted toward the cutting table. Find anything? The question came too quickly. Mara noticed. No. Daniel's expression relaxed. Good. She almost smiled. Why is that good? He looked down the street before answering. Because the building is dangerous. You already told me that. It's more serious than I thought. Then why didn't Grandma close it? Daniel rubbed his jaw. She was stubborn. Mara watched him. He had never called Grandma stubborn before. Not when she refused to sell the shop. Not when developers offered her money. Not when the roof began leaking. Daniel always called her sentimental. That difference mattered. What did you mean at the lawyer's office? Mara asked. About what? You looked at my note. Daniel's face tightened. What note? The one you were staring at. He stepped closer. Mara, you're grieving. Don't turn everything into some kind of puzzle. Did Grandma ever talk to you about the mannequin? His silence answered first. Then he shook his head. No. You're lying. Daniel's eyes hardened. You've been inside this place for less than an hour and already think you know something? Mara said nothing. He lowered his voice. Sell the shop. Why? I'll give you $2,000. Mara stared at him. Yesterday he had called the building worthless. Now he was offering $2,000 for it. That's a strange amount. It's more than the shop is worth. Then you won't mind if I keep it. Daniel's jaw clenched. You don't understand what you're holding. The words came out before he could stop them. Mara stepped closer. What am I holding? He looked away. For the first time, fear crossed his face. Not guilt, fear. Think about the offer, he said. Then he walked toward his car. Mara watched the taillights disappear around the corner. She locked the door. When she returned to the cutting table, the leather notebook was gone. She stopped. The drawer was still open. The newspaper was still there. The photograph remained, but the notebook had vanished. Mara searched the floor. Nothing. Then she noticed the blue coat on the mannequin. One of its unfinished pockets was sticking outward. Something had been placed inside it. Mara reached in. Her fingers closed around a folded sheet of paper. She opened it. It was not Grandma's handwriting. Only one sentence had been written across the page. "Stop looking for what they buried. Look for who buried it." Mara read the sentence again. "Stop looking for what they buried. Look for who buried it." The handwriting was unfamiliar. The letters leaned sharply to the right, as though whoever wrote them had been in a hurry. She folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. Then she heard footsteps outside. Mara killed the flashlight. The footsteps stopped. A second later, someone knocked on the glass. Not Daniel. This knock was heavier. 3 slow taps. Mara moved toward the front window without making a sound. An old man stood beneath the awning. He wore a brown wool coat that looked older than Mara's mother. His grey hair was flattened by the rain, and he held a battered umbrella with one broken spoke. Mara opened the door 2 inches. "Can I help you?" The old man looked at the sign above her, then at Mara. "You must be Evelyn's girl." "My grandmother's name was Evelyn." "I know." He lowered the umbrella. "Name's Walter Pike." Mara had heard the name. Grandma mentioned Walter occasionally, usually when talking about the shop. "He used to deliver fabric," she remembered. Walter gave a small grunt. "Used to do plenty of things." He looked past her into the shop. "Your grandmother ever tell you why she kept that mannequin?" Mara didn't answer. Walter noticed. "She told me you'd ask eventually." "Ask what?" "Why she never sold this place." Mara opened the door wider. Walter stepped inside. He didn't look around like a stranger. He knew where everything was. He walked directly to the old radiator beside the window and placed his umbrella against the wall. "Still doesn't work." "You remember that?" "I remember your grandmother cussing at it every winter." Mara almost smiled. Walter noticed the expression. "Good. She'd like that." He took off his coat. Mara studied him. "Did you know my grandfather?" Walter's hands stopped. "Thomas?" "Yes." Everybody knew Thomas. "What happened to him?" Walter looked toward the mannequin. "Your family told you he ran off." "Yes. That's what they wanted people to believe." Mara waited. Walter rubbed a thumb across the edge of his coat sleeve. "Thomas found something." "What?" "Records." "What kind of records?" "Land records." The answer was quiet. Back then, this whole side of downtown was different. Small businesses, family shops, apartments upstairs, people owned little pieces of everything. Mara glanced toward the newspaper clipping. Thomas thought some of those properties had been stolen. Walter nodded. He wasn't the only one. "Who stole them?" Walter looked at her. "You ask too fast. Because nobody tells me anything." "Your grandmother did." "When?" "Not enough." He walked toward the cutting table. His hand rested on its edge. "She spent 30 years making sure the right papers survived." Mara's throat tightened. "What papers?" Walter didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the mannequin. "Your grandmother once told me something." "What?" He looked directly at Mara. "She said, the first deed is only the beginning." Mara felt the folded note in her pocket. The same words. "Exactly." Walter stepped back from the table. "If you've found the first one, don't show it to Daniel." Mara stared at him. "Why?" Walter reached for his umbrella. "Because your brother isn't the only man who's been waiting for that deed." He opened the door. Before stepping outside, he added quietly, "And some of them aren't waiting to buy it." Walter was halfway down the sidewalk when Mara called after him. "Mr. Pike!" He stopped. Rain had started again, thin and steady. Mara stepped beneath the awning. "You said my grandmother made sure the papers survived. What papers?" Walter looked back at the shop. For a moment he seemed to be deciding how much trouble an old man could still afford. Then he returned. Your grandmother wasn't hiding money. Mara waited. She was hiding proof. Proof of what? Walter lowered his voice. Who really owned this block? Mara glanced toward the construction cranes 3 streets away. The new Mercer Plaza project had been impossible to miss for months. Glass towers were rising behind temporary fencing. Every few weeks another old storefront disappeared. Daniel's deal. Walter nodded. That's the one. How long has he been involved? Long enough to know better. Mara felt anger rise in her throat. How much does he owe them? Walter's eyebrows lifted. Your brother told you? Not exactly. Then don't let him know what you found. Mara folded her arms. You're avoiding the question. Because numbers aren't the dangerous part. He leaned closer. People are. Mara watched rain gather along the edge of the awning. Walter continued. 20 years ago, your grandfather was trying to stop the same family of investors from buying this neighborhood through shell companies. Shell companies? Names on paper. Different companies. Same money. He tapped the side of his nose. Thomas figured it out. What happened? Walter looked away. He went to the bank one morning and never came back to the office. Mara's face tightened. My family said he disappeared. Your family said plenty. Walter's voice carried no bitterness, just fatigue. He was accused of stealing money from his own business. By the time he tried to defend himself, too, his records were gone. Who took them? Walter looked at her. That's what your grandmother spent the rest of her life proving. Mara thought about the leather notebook, the photograph, the hidden drawer, the sentence on the paper. Where is the notebook? Walter's expression changed. What notebook? She knew immediately. He had lied. You know about it? Walter sighed. Your grandmother didn't trust paper alone. What does that mean? It means a document can disappear. He tapped his chest. A witness is harder to erase. Mara stared at him. Walter reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small brass object. A key. Different from the one Mara had found. This one had a red thread tied around it. Your grandmother gave me this 12 years ago. Mara took it carefully. What does it open? Walter shook his head. Not yet. Why not? Because you're looking in the wrong place. He pointed toward the shop window. The mannequin isn't the hiding place. Mara frowned. Then what is it? Walter gave a tired smile. It's the instruction. Before Mara could ask what he meant, a dark sedan rolled slowly past the shop. Walter watched it. His smile vanished. Go inside. Why? Because whoever's driving that car has been watching this building since before your grandmother died. The sedan continued down the street. Mara looked at the rear window. She couldn't see the driver, but she could see someone in the passenger seat, holding a camera. Walter closed his umbrella. Lock the door, Mara. He handed her the brass key. And whatever happens tonight, don't put that key anywhere Daniel can find it. Mara locked the door after Walter left. She checked it twice. Then she pulled the blinds across the front windows and stood in the darkness, watching the street through a narrow gap. The sedan was gone. She waited another 5 minutes. Nothing moved except rain. Mara turned back toward the shop. The brass key Walter had given her sat in her palm. A tiny number had been stamped into the metal. 31, not 17. She walked toward the cutting table. The old sewing machines were lined against the wall, their black enamel chipped around the edges. Grandma had kept them clean even after most of them stopped working. Mara ran her fingers across the largest machine. A memory surfaced. She was 9 years old, sitting beneath the cutting table while Grandma argued with a customer over the price of a repaired coat. The customer had complained that $20 was too much. Grandma had looked at Mara and whispered, People will pay twice as much to avoid being told no. Mara smiled at the memory. Then she noticed something underneath the table, a small metal plate. She crouched. It had been painted the same brown as the wood. Only one corner had started to peel. Mara scraped it gently with her fingernail. A number appeared. 31. Her pulse quickened. She searched the rest of the table. Nothing. Then she remembered the brass key. Mara inserted it into a tiny slot hidden behind the metal plate. The lock clicked. A section of the table slid backward. Behind it was a narrow compartment. Inside sat a sealed envelope. Mara pulled it out. Her grandmother's handwriting covered the front. For Mara. Only after you find the first deed. Mara opened it. There was a single photograph. It showed the Tailor shop in 1989. The storefront looked almost new. Grandma stood beside the mannequin. Thomas stood behind her, but there was not a tart, her person in the photograph. A young man Mara didn't recognize. He was holding a folder. Mara turned the photograph over. 3 words were written across the back. Ask about Mercer. She stared at the name. Mercer, the same name printed on the construction signs outside downtown. Mara pulled out her phone and searched the company. Mercer Development Group. Chief Executive Officer, Richard Harlan. She knew the name. Everyone in town did. Harlan had purchased half the downtown district over the last 5 years, and according to a newspaper article Mara found, Harlan's company had signed a redevelopment agreement with Daniel Vale 6 weeks earlier. Mara read the article twice. Then she found the number. $85,000. Daniel had received an $85,000 advance. The agreement required him to provide clear title within 21 days. Mara looked at the date. Her hands went still. 7 days had already passed. 14 remained. She thought about Daniel standing in the doorway. I need you to sell me the shop, not because it was worthless, because he needed something inside it. Mara opened the envelope again. There was one final sheet folded beneath the photograph. She unfolded it. This time, the handwriting was shaky. Mara, if Daniel asks you to sell the shop, do not accept his first offer. Mara stopped reading. A second sentence followed. He will offer more when he realizes you found it. Then, beneath that, and when he does, ask him one question. Where is the second deed? Mara lowered the page. Outside, a car door slammed. Someone had returned. Mara stayed away from the windows. The sound outside faded after a minute, but she didn't move until she heard an engine start and pull away. She waited. Then she read Grandma's note again. Where is the second deed? The question made no sense. She hadn't found a first deed. Not yet. She had found a photograph, a warning, and enough strange pieces to make her suspicious. But the actual property document was still missing. Mara returned to the mannequin. The blue coat hung quietly from its shoulders. She touched the wooden base. This time, she noticed something she'd missed before. 4 screws. 3 were brass. 1 was steel. The steel screw had no dust around its head. Mara found a screwdriver in the back room. It took nearly 5 minutes to loosen the screw. When it finally came free, something inside the base clicked. Mara stopped. She removed the remaining screws. The mannequin lifted away from the floor. Underneath was a circular metal plate, not part of the original building. Someone had installed it later. Mara crouched and brushed away the dust. A thin groove ran around the edge. She slipped the screwdriver into it and pried. The plate lifted. Inside was a narrow metal tube. Mara stared at it. She remembered Grandma's note. Whatever they tell you about the mannequin, don't let them throw it away. Her hands were shaking now. She pulled the tube free. It was sealed with wax. No lock, no key. Just a small blue thread wrapped around the center. The same color as the coat. Mara broke the wax. A rolled document slid into her hand. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was old. Official seals covered the bottom. Property description, parcel number, names. Mara read the first line, then the second. She sat down on the floor. The deed did not belong to the Tailor shop. It covered a large section of the downtown block, including the parcel where Mercer Plaza was being built. Mara checked the legal description again. She wasn't mistaken. Her grandmother had owned the land. Not Daniel, not the developer. Grandma. And the transfer that Daniel had signed appeared nowhere in the chain of title. Mara looked at the signature. Evelyn Vale. The date was 1989. She turned the document over. There was writing on the back. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. The first deed is only the beginning. Mara whispered it. The first deed is only the beginning. Then she noticed something beneath the sentence. A second line. This one had been written much later. If they find this one, they will come for the shop. Mara's mouth went dry. She folded the deed and slipped it into her bag. Her phone rang. Daniel. She let it ring. Again. Then a message appeared. 20,000. Mara stared at the screen. Another message arrived. Final offer. She didn't answer. A third message followed. You don't understand what happens if you keep that property. Mara looked toward the front window. The shop was dark. The street was empty. Then she heard the back door handle turn. Slowly, someone was trying to get inside. Daniel offered Mara $20,000 on a Thursday morning. He did not call it an offer at first. He called it a favor. Mara was standing behind the cutting table, sorting through her grandmother's old account books when her phone rang. She almost ignored it. Daniel had called 6 times since Tuesday, and every conversation ended the same way. Sell the shop, she answered. What? I can be there in 10 minutes. I'm busy. This won't take long. Then say it now. There was a pause. 20,000. Mara stopped turning the pages. She looked toward the front window. Rain had left thin trails across the glass, blurring the construction cranes several blocks away. 20,000 for a condemned building? You're not stupid, Mara. I never said I was. You know there's value here. That sentence stayed with her, not because of the money, because Daniel had spent weeks telling everyone the opposite. Mara closed the ledger. How much did you get from Harlan? Silence. She waited. That's not your concern. It became my concern when you started offering me money. Daniel exhaled sharply. The original advance was $85,000. And you've spent it? I had obligations. How much is left? Another pause. 7,000. Mara stared at the old sewing machine beside her. Its needle was still threaded with blue cotton. Grandma had always hated wasting thread. Even a length shorter than her palm went into a jar beneath the counter. You're offering me 20,000 when you only have 7? I can borrow the rest. From Harlan. Don't worry about where it comes from. Mara almost smiled. That was exactly the problem. Nobody in her family ever wanted her to ask where things came from. She walked toward the mannequin. The blue coat was still hanging from its shoulders. Mara had removed it twice, since discovering the deed, yet every time she returned it to exactly the same position. She reached behind the mannequin and touched the wooden frame. Daniel's voice came through the phone. Mara? Why 20,000? Because that's what I can manage. No. What? I'm not selling. His voice changed. The warmth disappeared. You don't understand what you're holding. Mara looked down at the deed. I think I'm starting to. You found something in that shop. It wasn't a question. Mara said nothing. Daniel swore under his breath. Then he lowered his voice. Listen to me. Whatever Grandma told you, she was sick near the end. She wasn't thinking clearly. Mara's fingers tightened around the phone. Funny. What? She was clear enough to leave me the shop. Daniel didn't answer. Mara stepped closer to the mannequin. Did she ever tell you about the second deed? The silence on the other end lasted too long. Mara heard traffic behind him. Then a car door slammed. Finally, Daniel spoke. Where did you hear that? She smiled without meaning to. I didn't. Another silence. Grandma wrote it. Mara ended the call. For several seconds, she stood completely still. Then she looked at the mannequin, at its wooden base, at the floor beneath it. The first deed had been hidden there. But Grandma had written that the first deed was only the beginning. Mara crouched beside the mannequin and ran her fingers along the floorboards. One board felt different. Not loose. Newer. She fetched a screwdriver from the workbench. The first screw came out easily. The second did not. Mara leaned harder. Wood creaked. Something metallic clicked beneath the board. She froze. Then she slowly lifted the plank. There was a narrow black space underneath, and inside that space sat a small brass key wrapped in a piece of yellowed cloth. A hand. Written word had been stitched into the cloth with blue thread. Bell Street. Mara carried the brass key to the front counter and set it beside the deed. For several minutes, she did nothing. Bell Street. The words on the cloth were impossible to ignore. That was the address of the house Daniel had inherited. The house Grandma had supposedly owned, free and clear. Mara picked up the key again. It was small, old-fashioned, and slightly bent near the teeth. A tiny number had been scratched into its handle. 21. She remembered Daniel's words. 21 days. Her chair scraped against the floor as she stood. The phone rang. Daniel. Mara watched his name appear on the screen. She didn't answer. It stopped, then rang again. She turned the phone face down. Outside, a truck rumbled past the shop. Through the dusty window, Mara could see the tall blue construction fence surrounding the future Mercer Plaza site. Workers in orange vests moved behind it while an excavator sat idle in the rain. That entire block was being prepared for something Daniel had already promised away, and Grandma had hidden a key connected to Bell Street. Mara slipped it into her coat pocket. She needed to see the house. Before she could reach the door, someone knocked. 3 slow taps. Mara stopped. A man's voice came from outside. "Mara, it's me, Daniel." She looked through the glass. He was standing beside a black sedan. This time he wasn't alone. A tall man in a grey wool coat stood beside him, holding a leather folder beneath one arm. Mara recognized him from the newspaper photographs. Victor Harlan, the developer behind Mercer Plaza. Mara opened the door but kept the chain fastened. Victor smiled. "Miss Vale, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot." "You've never met me." "Exactly." His smile widened. "That's why I'd like to correct that." Daniel looked impatient. Mara kept her hand on the door. Victor raised the folder. "Chet, I've prepared an agreement. $20,000 paid immediately in exchange for the Tailor property and any associated claims." "Associated claims?" His smile disappeared for half a second. "Standard language." Mara looked at Daniel. "You told him about the deed?" Daniel stepped forward. "I told him there might be a paperwork issue." Victor corrected him quietly. "There is more than a paperwork issue." Mara noticed the way Daniel looked at him, not like a brother looking at a businessman, like an employee waiting for permission. Victor opened the folder. "You have until tomorrow afternoon, Or, we proceed with the development agreement through other legal channels. Mara almost laughed. You need my signature. We prefer it. That's not what you said. Victor's expression hardened. Daniel moved closer to the doorway. Mara, take the money. She shook her head. No. Victor glanced toward the interior of the shop. His eyes settled on the mannequin. Only for a second. But Mara saw it. He knew. Not about the deed. About the mannequin. Victor closed the folder. 20,000 is generous for a building that may be condemned. Mara looked directly at him. Then you shouldn't have come here. His jaw tightened. Daniel whispered something to him. Victor stepped back. Before leaving, he looked at Mara one last time. You're making this harder than it needs to be. The sedan pulled away. Mara locked the door. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass key. 21. Then she looked toward the street sign visible through the window. Bell Street was only 9 blocks away. Mara grabbed her coat. She had no intention of waiting until tomorrow. Not anymore. Bell Street looked different after dark. Mara remembered it from childhood as a quiet row of brick houses where Grandma would make her walk on the inside of the pavement. The house at number 42 had once been painted yellow. Now the paint had faded to the color of old paper, and the iron fence leaned toward the sidewalk. Mara stood across the street for a moment. Daniel's car wasn't there. Neither was Victor Harlan's. She crossed anyway. The brass key fit the front door. That bothered her more than it should have. Grandma had always kept this house locked. Even family members needed to knock. The lock turned with a dry metallic click. Inside, the air smelled faintly of furniture polish and cedar. Mara switched on the hallway light. Nothing happened. She tried again, still dark. The electricity had been disconnected. She used her phone flashlight. The familiar hallway appeared in narrow pieces. Grandma's umbrella stand, the framed photograph of Mara at 8 years old missing her front tooth, a small porcelain bird on the table. Mara touched the photograph as she passed. Then she heard something upstairs, a scrape. She stopped. Another sound followed, a drawer closing. Someone was inside. Mara backed toward the door. Who's there? No answer. She reached for the handle. The front door wouldn't open. Mara pulled harder, locked. She tried the key. Nothing. Someone had turned the deadbolt from inside. Her phone vibrated. A message from Daniel. You need to leave the house. Mara stared at the screen. Another message arrived. Now. She typed back. Are you inside? 3 dots appeared. Then disappeared. Mara heard footsteps overhead. Slow, careful, coming down the stairs. She moved into the dining room and crouched behind the half-open door. A man's shoes appeared at the bottom step, black leather, wet at the edges. He walked into the hallway. Mara couldn't see his face. He stopped beside the porcelain bird. Then he picked it up. For some reason, that tiny movement frightened her more than the footsteps had. He wasn't searching randomly. He knew where to look. The man carried the bird into the study. A drawer opened. Paper shifted. Mara held her breath. Then her phone slipped from her hand. It struck the floor. The man went silent. Mara ran. She slammed her shoulder against the front door. This time it opened. She stumbled onto the sidewalk and kept moving until she reached the corner. Only then did she turn. The upstairs window of number 42 was lit. A figure stood behind the curtain, watching. Mara crossed the street and ducked beneath a closed pharmacy awning. Her hands were shaking badly enough that she had trouble unlocking her phone. She called Daniel. He answered immediately. Where are you? Your house. A long pause. Our house. Someone was inside. Daniel didn't ask who. That frightened her. Daniel? His voice came quietly. Did you find the study? Mara looked back toward Bell Street. How did you know I went there? He didn't answer. She remembered the brass key, the number 21. Then she remembered something else. The porcelain bird. Grandma had kept it for years. Mara had never seen it outside the study. She looked at the photograph on her phone. She had taken it before leaving. In the picture, the bird's hollow wooden base was visible, and beneath it, barely readable in the dust, were 4 carved words. The second deed waits. Mara did not go back to the tailor shop that night. She stayed at a 24-hour diner 3 blocks from Bell Street, sitting in the last booth beneath a flickering ceiling light. The waitress brought her coffee without asking. Mara had been there twice before, years ago, when Grandma's car broke down nearby. She remembered the waitress had always worn a silver watch. Tonight, the woman wore the same watch. Mara stared at the coffee until the surface stopped moving. Someone had entered Bell Street before her. Someone knew about the study, and Daniel had known she would find it. At 4:17 in the morning, Mara finally called the attorney who had handled the will. His name was Harold Price. He answered, sounding half asleep. Mara, I'm sorry to call this late. Is everything all right? No. She told him about the key. She told him about the deed. She did not mention the second deed yet. When she finished, Harold was quiet. Then he asked one question. Where did you get the key? Grandma's shop. Another pause. Mara, your grandmother specifically instructed me never to discuss certain documents with Daniel. Mara sat upright. What documents? I can't tell you over the phone. Why? Because I signed an affidavit. About what? Harold lowered his voice. Ownership records. Mara looked toward the window. A delivery truck passed through the rain. How many? What? How many properties? He didn't answer. That was enough. Mara closed her eyes. Tomorrow morning. My office. 9 o'clock. The call ended. At 6:30, Mara returned to the tailor shop. The front door was unlocked. She knew she had locked it. She entered slowly. Nothing appeared disturbed at first. Then she saw the cutting table. Every drawer was open. Fabric had been pulled from the shelves and left in heaps on the floor. Her grandmother's old accounting books were scattered beneath the window. Mara walked to the mannequin. The blue coat was gone. Someone had taken it. She looked beneath the mannequin. The wooden base was still there, but the screws had been removed. Mara crouched. A thin line of mud crossed the floor. It led from the rear entrance to the mannequin. Fresh mud. She followed it. The rear door stood open by 2 inches. Outside, wet footprints disappeared into the alley. Mara stepped closer. Something was caught on the door hinge, a strip of grey wool, the same fabric Victor Harlan had been wearing the previous afternoon. She pulled it free. Her phone rang. Victor. Mara answered. Did you break into my shop? No. You took the blue coat. I don't know what you're talking about. Then why are you calling? His voice was calm, too calm. Because your brother has made a serious mistake. Mara waited. Victor continued. He borrowed money against property he didn't own. I know. And now you're holding the only thing that can prove it. Mara looked at the empty mannequin. What happens if I record the deed? Victor breathed out slowly. Your brother loses the development deal. And you? I lose $43 million. The number sat between them. For the first time, Mara understood why 20,000 had sounded so insulting. Victor wasn't trying to buy a building. He was trying to buy silence. Then he said something that made Mara stop breathing. Your grandmother kept the original records because your grandfather failed to protect them. Mara gripped the phone. What happened to my grandfather? Victor hung up. At that exact moment, something slid beneath the rear door. A folded envelope. Mara picked it up. Her grandmother's handwriting covered the front. Mara Vale. And beneath her name were 6 words. Do not trust the man who remembers him. Mara read the sentence twice. Do not trust the man who remembers him. She turned the envelope over. It had been sealed with ordinary brown tape. No stamp, no address. Someone had placed it beneath the door only seconds earlier. Mara looked through the narrow glass panel. The alley was empty. She opened the envelope with the edge of a ruler. Inside was a single photograph. Her grandfather stood outside the tailor shop, much younger than Mara remembered him. He was wearing a dark suit with one hand resting on the shoulder of a man Mara had never seen before. Behind them stood the same building, only it wasn't surrounded by empty lots and construction fences. The photograph showed an entire row of storefronts stretching down the block. Mara turned it over. A date had been written on the back, October 14th, 1987. Below it, another line. Ask Harold about the blue ledger. Mara put the photograph on the cutting table. Harold. The attorney had mentioned ownership records, and now Grandma was sending her toward him. Mara drove to his office just before 9. The building was quiet. Harold was waiting beside a filing cabinet when she entered. He looked at the photograph and sat down without taking off his coat. You found it. What is the blue ledger? Harold rubbed his forehead. I was hoping you wouldn't have to ask. Then answer me. He opened the filing cabinet. There was a locked metal box inside. Harold removed it and placed it on the desk. I can't give you the original records, he said, but I can tell you what your grandmother spent 37 years protecting. Mara stared at the box. Her father? Your grandfather. Harold corrected himself. Your grandfather discovered that several downtown properties had been transferred using forged signatures. The owners were immigrants who didn't have money for lawyers. Some couldn't read the documents they were given. Mara swallowed. How many properties? 23. He opened the box. Inside was a blue cloth ledger. The cover was faded almost grey. Mara touched it. My grandfather disappeared because of this. Harold nodded. He was accused of falsifying financial records. The accusation destroyed his business. 2 weeks before the hearing, he vanished. Did he run? I never believed that. Harold opened the ledger. Several pages had been removed, but one remained. It showed property addresses, original owners, transfer dates, and amounts paid. The final entry was number 24. 42 Bell Street. Mara stared at it. That's Grandma's house. It wasn't always hers. Harold turned another page. A handwritten note filled the margin. The property was transferred back in 1991. No signature, no buyer, just a reference number. Mara looked at him. What does that mean? Harold reached into the box again. This time he removed a small envelope. Your grandmother left this with me 12 years ago. Why didn't you give it to me? Because she told me to wait until you came asking the right question. Mara opened the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a document. At the bottom was a familiar signature. Her grandfather's. But the signature wasn't on a deed. It was on a sworn statement accusing Victor Harlan's father of fraud. Mara looked up. Harlan knew. Harold's expression tightened. Victor wasn't the man who remembered your grandfather. Mara looked back at the photograph. The unknown man standing beside him suddenly seemed familiar. She had seen that face before. On the wall of Victor Harlan's office, Mara returned to the tailor shop with the blue ledger tucked inside her coat. By noon, Daniel had called 14 times. She answered the 15th. I know about the 85,000, she said. Daniel went quiet. I know about Harlan. I know you promised him the block, And I know Grandma kept records proving the transfers were fraudulent. Mara, listen to me. No, you listen. Her voice surprised her. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. You offered me $20,000 for a condemned shop because you were desperate. Then someone broke into Grandma's house. Someone searched this shop. Someone took the blue coat. Daniel breathed heavily. I didn't take it. Who did? I don't know. You expect me to believe that? I was trying to protect you. Mara looked at the mannequin. From what? Daniel didn't answer. Then he whispered, Harlan's father destroyed Grandpa. Mara closed her eyes. You knew. I found out 3 years ago. And you still signed the agreement. I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice. Daniel's voice cracked. I owed the bank $112,000. Mara said nothing. I thought I could fix it. Harlan offered me the advance. I thought the old records were gone. Grandma knew they weren't. Yes. The word came out almost too softly to hear. Mara ended the call. That afternoon she met Harold at the county records office. They filed the deed. Then the second document. Then the blue ledger. By 4:30 a judge had issued a temporary order stopping construction on the disputed parcels. Victor Harlan arrived at the hearing furious. He brought contracts. Mara brought originals. He brought accountants. Harold brought 37 years of correspondence. And when Harlan claimed he had never known about the old ownership dispute, Harold placed the recorded statement from 1987 before the court. Harlan's own father's signature was on it. So was the payment receipt showing the purchase had never been completed. The room went quiet. Victor looked toward Daniel. Daniel wouldn't meet his eyes. The redevelopment project collapsed within a month. Harlan's company filed for bankruptcy protection 6 weeks later. Daniel lost the Bell Street house after the bank discovered the loan documents tied to the failed agreement. Mara never accepted his apology, but she didn't watch him lose everything with satisfaction either. She sold part of the recovered downtown property and used the money to settle the unpaid taxes on Grandma's shop. The demolition order disappeared. 6 months later, the old Tailor shop reopened. Mara kept the original sign above the door. Vale Tailoring. She repaired the leaking roof first, then the front window. The mannequin stayed exactly where Grandma had left it. The blue coat was restored and placed inside a glass case near the counter. Beside it sat the brass key. The blue ledger remained in a locked cabinet, available to the families whose names appeared inside. Mara also placed a small photograph of her grandparents on the wall. Underneath it, she wrote one sentence. Some things are worth saving before they are worth selling. On the first winter evening after reopening, Mara finished closing the shop at 7:14. She turned off the lights one by one. Outside, snow had begun settling on Bell Street. Before leaving, she paused beside the mannequin. For years, people had called the building worthless. Now the windows glowed warmly over the sidewalk, and somewhere beneath the floorboards, old wood creaked as the building settled into another cold night. Mara locked the door. Then she looked back through the glass. The mannequin stood in the blue coat, facing the empty street, at exactly where Grandma had left her.